jumping in here with healing through conflict. I'm very excited to get started today. My name is Alicia Dunams, and I've been a volunteer for CYS, Sentinel Youth Services, since 2018, and it has been my pleasure to work in this community organization that is really changing the dynamic in terms of healing communities and making safer communities. And so as you come in, please share in the chat, say hi and where you're calling in from or where you're jumping in from. You can put that in the Q&A or in the chat. And I'm going to be introducing our host here, Pastor Joe Paul. And Joe Paul, you'll be really hosting us today. We have a lot of awesome content that we're going to be sharing in terms of healing through conflict, that we can indeed create safer communities. We can enrich the lives of young people through peace work and through mediation work. So I'm very excited. So Joe, please jump in and introduce yourself.
No problem. Hello, everybody. My name is Joe Paul. As I was recognized, that I am with clergy. I am the pastor over our political and civic affairs for a large church here in Los Angeles. One of my other many hats, the Vice President of Network Partnerships and Government Relations for the Los Angeles Regional Reentry Partnership. I'll provide some information in the chat around that. And then lastly, one of the most recent things that I really have taken passionately under my I guess purview is violence interruption work on the East Coast, really dealing with a lot of the urban-based violence that's going on amongst our young people. And I'm really excited about that project. So enough about me. I'm glad to be here for this session tonight. And you are in for an amazing treat. I think that what has been amassed by Jessica Ellis and her wonderful team at Sentinel Youth Services, especially across the continuum of this work, is important. And so without further ado, I got a couple of housekeeping things I got to run by you guys, and then we'll get into this great panel. I'll do a couple of introductions. Certainly by the time we get done with the sharing of the panelists, we will provide time at the end of this discussion for your Q&A, and we look forward to your contribution to joining us in this discussion this evening. So just by way of ground rules and some backdrop for what's going on right now, I want to welcome you to the second of 4 webinars that Sentinel Youth Services has been hosting. This 4-part series, which is free and obviously open to the public, has been spread out over the next 6 months, and it aims to educate, engage, collaborate on the subject of restorative justice. If you weren't able to attend the introductory webinar last month, please visit CYS's website to check out the recording of the webinar. And our dear friend Nat is going to put that access in that link in the chat so you can grab it and take a look at it at your discretion. And tune in at the end of this session here today to hear about the final 2 sessions that will be taking place for the remainder of this year. One of those sessions is labeled Stronger Schools Through Restorative Justice, and the second part is The Gift of the Apology Letter. So restorative justice has many facets, which is why they've broken these conversations up over 4 parts. A large and important part of restorative justice is healing. Healing together, healing individually, healing through conflict, which is why we're here today with these 3 experts on the subject of healing. For today's panel, as you know, I'll moderate, and we'll engage a conversation between Alicia, Mark, and Jeremy. This conversation will take place for about the next 30 minutes or so, and then again, we'll open up for Q&A, and then we'll try to wrap this thing up around 6 o'clock. We want to give you time to see the game tonight. So just as Alicia said, you can submit questions in the chat. You can use the Q&A feature within this Zoom. And just looking forward to our dialogue tonight. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we'll jump into a few questions. Really had a brief opportunity before we came on and introduced ourselves to you guys in general to get to know the panelists more personally. So first we have up Dr. Mark Goulston. He's the co-founder of the Deeper Coaching Institute and co-creator of Deeper Coaching Certification, Divisions on Global Leadership. And then Dr. Jeremy Pollack. He's a social psychologist and a leader in the field of workplace conflict resolution and peace building. Good to have you, Dr. Pollack. And then lastly, we have our dear friend, Alicia Dunams. She's a CYS volunteer and also an author of How to Talk to Your Enemies. There you go. And I'm sure they're going to share a little bit more about their literature and their work as they share out. But Dr. Goulston, you're going to be up first. First question I'm going to throw at you. From some of your work, you believe that if people could turn conflict from something negative they avoid or make worse into something positive, and the greatest opportunity for personal growth and development, that they look forward to it could change the global mindset in a moment. Can you explain a little bit more what your thoughts are around that statement?
Well, thank you. And thank you to my fellow panelists. And it's a privilege to be here. When you ask most people what they think of the word conflict, most people have a negative connotation about it. They don't see it positively. And usually that's because they've been in conflicts that just escalated. They watched the conflict between their parents and it didn't seem to go anywhere. And so given the fact that most people have a universal view of conflict as a negative, if you could see it through different eyes as something, when it happens, you may not like it, but if you could say to yourself, this is a great opportunity. And if you could, and there's actually 3 parts to the great opportunity. So if you're getting into a conflict, this is what you say to yourself: opportunity for poise, opportunity for empathy, and opportunity for growth. Opportunity for poise, empathy, and growth. And the first one's probably, really important because you're using that as a way to sort of calm yourself down instead of letting it escalate. And you say to yourself, radical patience. And it's a prompt you give yourself, radical patience. And what that means is you don't do anything to make it worse. And it may even mean you don't do anything. So it's a way to calm yourself down. Something that some people find helpful is also to say to yourself, when you've been triggered, to acknowledge it. The next step could be, I suggest people say downshift. So what downshift means is when you downshift in a car, you actually pull the road towards you. Whereas when you step on the accelerator, you go off the cliff. So just saying to yourself, triggered, downshift, and then pause, it can calm you down. And then the next thing you want to say to yourself is opportunity for empathy. So how that works is you ask yourself, what am I upset about? And then you go down a little bit deeper. What am I really upset about? And so the more that you can actually empathize with yourself, you can actually talk yourself down from escalating. Sometimes what's helpful is to think of someone who cares about you, a parent, a mentor, and you can imagine them saying to you, or someone saying to me, Mark, what are you upset about? What are you really upset about? And then if you're dealing with someone and it's starting to escalate, after you figure out what you're really upset about, and underneath the upset is, what do I feel hurt about? What do I feel afraid of? What do I feel disappointed about? What you then do is, if it's starting to escalate, the next thing is opportunity for growth. And what you say to that person is, hold off. And in a non-aggressive way, it's hold off, and they're going to go, what? Yeah, hold off. And then they're going to go, what? But that's been a pattern interrupt. And you say, I was just figuring out what I'm most upset about, and I think I've got it figured out. Give me a moment. What? Because I think I figured out what you're most upset about and what you're most frustrated about, what you're most angry about, what you're most disappointed about. And I'm almost there. So hold off, hold off. Can I run it by you? And so that's the opportunity for growth. But the key is the first one, opportunity for poise. So you calm yourself down. And then when you drill down into yourself with the second part, opportunity for empathy, that's a way of really calming yourself down. You know, oh, I'm really angry. Yeah, I understand I'm angry, but what am I really upset about? And that calming changes the energy. And then when you change the energy and you say to them, hold on for a moment, stop it, it doesn't escalate it, because what's happened is you have calmed yourself down through empathy. And what happened, and Jeremy can probably speak to this, is you've averted an amygdala hijack. So when you can empathize with yourself, or imagine someone who cares about you talking you down from DEFCON 1 to DEFCON 5, what happens is that process of empathy actually triggers something in your brain called oxytocin. And oxytocin is an emotional connection. And oxytocin directly counteracts something called cortisol, high cortisol. Look it up. Look up the relationship between oxytocin and high cortisol, and it counteracts it. And when your high cortisol goes down, your amygdala, which is a part of your brain that can trigger you to go into reacting mode and fight or flight, as the cortisol goes down from the oxytocin, actually what happens is blood flow goes from your lower brain to your upper brain, and you can start to think. And not only that, when you say to the other person, stop, you're taking charge of the situation. You're not yelling at them. You're actually showing a certain vulnerability when you say, stop. And when you do that, you can take charge of the situation. And I think if you practice this, then anytime a conflict comes up, if you see it as an opportunity to handle it differently, what you're going to notice is you're different from everyone else. And also, if you can handle a conflict in that calm way, what happens is people's respect for you goes way up, because they're looking at you expecting you to lose it, to lose your cool. And when they see instead that you're calm and taking charge and feeling and showing empathy to the other person, it just draws people to you, because what you're doing is you're taking a situation and creating psychological safety. And then what happens is your respect for yourself goes through the roof. You'll leave a conversation like that and you'll say, you go, girl, you're classy. That was a classy thing to do. Where did you learn that from? Not from your parents. But what happens is you start to feel better about yourself. So
you gave us a lot, and what I want to really lean in on are the three parts of that opportunity. And Jeremy, I want to really kind of direct this recap to you and have you lean in from your expertise around the conflicts in workplace. Obviously, in this day and age, conflicts can go from 0 to 100 with a whole lot of variables in between in the place of work. So when you think about what Dr. Goulston just offered in terms of opportunity through poise and empathy and growth, what are you hearing? And how does that apply to some of the conflicts you've been able to successfully navigate in these places of work that you have engaged?
Well, I think it's right on the money. I mean, I really like, I especially, I mean, we talk about this a lot when we do de-escalation training and feedback training, but I really like the first one, the opportunity for poise. I think a lot of people forget that opportunity exists for them, and a lot of times, unfortunately, people, the way you respond to a conflict is very much a choice. A lot of people respond in an automatic fashion, and that's part of the reason they should get training, is to become more deliberate in the type of strategy or the type of choice that they make when they respond to conflicts. And so some people, when they're making the choice, they maybe suggest, well, why should I always be the bigger person? Like, why do I have to be the one who always takes the high road or something like that? And especially if you're in a leadership position, I would suggest that, the burden's on you if you're in a leadership position. And if you're not in a leadership position and you still are trying to figure out how to respond, that opportunity for poise is so important, because you want to know that you walked away from that conversation, even if it didn't go well at the end of the day, that you showed up as the kind of person that you want to be. Right. So, yeah, so I really like that. And, I don't know if this is the right time to segue into this. It gets me thinking on this idea of, like, we talk about healing through conflict. So, like, what is healing exactly? Is that an appropriate segue into that? Or
Please, I think it's very appropriate.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because, like, there's a lot of ways that people might define healing, and to me, I think on one level, on maybe even not necessarily like the highest surface, but on some level, healing to me means rebuilding trust, in terms of an interpersonal conflict or even in intergroup conflicts. So how does one heal? How does one build trust? How does one heal? How does one build trust? Well, maybe there's some process of reconciliation about past events. Maybe there's some process of relationship agreement building or expectation setting for future interactions. So that's all important. But to me, really underlying trust, like, what is the foundation of trust? And to me, it's all about care. When I think about the idea of care, in other words, the perception that someone truly cares about me, that perception, that feeling of being cared for, cannot exist in the same space as defensiveness. And so if we can find a way through a conflict happening, if there's a conflict that's going on and I can feel during that conflict, then not only do I trust the individual in the way that they're responding, but also that they actually care about me. We might have some conflicting views or conflicting approaches or conflicting ideas, but on some deeper level, they actually care about me. Boy, it's much more likely that they're going to be able to be in that sort of frontal lobe, that prefrontal cortex area, and be able to creatively problem solve through a conflict, rather than go into that sort of midbrain amygdala, sympathetic nervous system, and start getting into a fight-flight modes. It's much more likely we can stay in what I would call baseline conflict, rather than getting to an emotionally escalated conflict. So how do we figure out then, how do I show someone that I care about them? How, even through conflict, we have some sort of conflicting idea or approach or something. In the midst of this, how can I make sure they know that I care about them, even though our ideas are different? And that's the big question for me. And if you can do that, boy, a lot of healing can take place through that conflict.
Excellent. And it really seems like we rehearsed this, because it's an excellent layup for me to lean in with. Alicia, your book is called How to Talk to Your Enemies, right? And so thinking about what Mark has shared and now what Jeremy's brought to the table in terms of specifically speaking to healing, when you talk about how to talk to your enemies, clearly you're in treacherous territory, or the first knee-jerk reaction to the title of the book seems like we're talking about specific conflict. So how, in what has been shared already, do you interpret bringing people into the room, dealing with all of the biological things that are going on, the history of people's experiences, the traumas that they may have, experienced when they were younger or older, or wherever those traumas occurred? And now we're talking about conflict. And now we're labeling folks even as enemies. In your interpretation, how do you really bring people into the same room on the same sheet of music to even humanize one another, to give that space for poise, empathy, and so forth and so on?
Thank you so much, Joe. Yeah, the title of my book, it can bristle some people because people are like, well, I don't want to talk to my enemies. They're going to harm me or they're going to hurt me. Why would I want to talk to my enemies? And that's one of the reasons I wrote this book is I believe that talking to your enemies is a portal to possibility in terms of transformation of self, transformation of the other person, and then transformation together. Because when two people come together with a dispute or conflicting beliefs, or one person was harmed by the other person, and they come together to talk it out through healing conversations, they can create a third possibility. They can create, an opportunity to create a forward vision together. And one thing I love about CYS and the work I do with CYS and is that CYS creates opportunities for community members to become mediators. And so that's one of the ways to heal a community is to teach people, everyday people, the skill of peacemaking, the skill of mediation. And then we reinforce that and become better when we go into these dispute situations with the youth. And then we're supporting the youth who are, again, children under 18 are, their brains aren't developed. A fully brain is developed by the time 25, 26 years old. So to be able to come into a room or into a Zoom room and to see the catharsis that happens, to see the realization of, oh, I did something wrong. I did something that hurt someone else, but this person's becoming my partner in creating a solution. Nelson Mandela says that when your enemy becomes your partner, then you create a solution together. And that's why I titled the book, How to Talk to Your Enemies, really Desmond Tutu. If you want peace, you don't talk to your friends, you talk to your enemies. And so I feel our next level personally of evolution and personal development and growth is by leaning into these conversations that are difficult, that are uncomfortable. And I've been in the room when a 13 or 14-year-old comes in, and then maybe a representative of the school is there, or the person they got in a fist fight is there. And that initial kind of quiet happens. And then there's like an exhale that begins when they're starting to talk about what happened, why it happened. And then when we're talking about solutions and when they see the person across the table is their partner, not their adversary, not their foe, not their enemy, but their partner in creating a solution together. So that's the powerful, like really, impactful impact that CYS and restorative justice does, especially, with youth, is not only teaching community members to be mediators, but also teaching those skills to students and to youth that will have those skills, for the rest of their life. You can't take that away from them. So some of the outcomes that we see in these rooms are like writing an apology letter that's been talked about before, doing volunteer cleanups at the school, or any type of volunteering, or just reflection letters. And so slowing down, and that's part of, we were talking about, to leave the amygdala when the amygdala is hijacked, to access the prefrontal cortex requires slowing down decision making, being able to listen to others. And we're teaching the youth how to access their prefrontal cortex. And so that's why this work is so powerful. And, going back to what Dr. Mark and Dr. Jeremy were speaking about, is I truly believe that talking to your enemies, connecting with someone, that there is healing available through conflict. It's like a portal into a place that we sometimes don't want to go, because our amygdala is like, I don't want to have this conversation. I don't want to be face to face with this person. But then as you get into the room and then the talking happens and the healing conversations happen, then there's that exhale, as I spoke about, and then there's like, what can we create? What can we create together? And so that co-creating a vision together is what's available on the other side of conflict.
Wow, this is so fascinating, and I'm thinking about obviously moving our conversation forward, but it's happening really naturally, and so hearing that restorative justice first of all, and bringing two opposing parties into a space, whether they're surrogates or the actual folks, and having them really, going back to their word empathy, empathize with one another, the positions that folks have come from to end up in the condition that they are, and really looking for what justice is like for that particular situation is magical stuff when it works the right way. But I'll go to you, Mark, with this. You've worked with suicidal patients for decades. I think somewhere in the range of like 35 years. And not one of them actually completed the full process of taking their own lives. When you think about this external relationship of listening and hearing and finding that place of poise, when you're dealing with a literal individual who is, the opposition, if you will, that's one thing. But when the enemy or when the opposition is internalized and you become the perpetrator against yourself, like, how do you use those experiences to speak to the larger volume of work that you're engaged in? Because I find that to be extremely fascinating.
Well, something that I observed with my suicidal patients is that, and I wrote a blog called Why People Kill Themselves, It's Not Depression, and it got 400,000 views in a couple of weeks. I wrote it after Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade died by suicide. And what I wrote about is that depression contributes to it. Loss of a job contributes to it. Loss of a relationship contributes to it. But there's hundreds of millions of people who have all those things and they don't kill themselves. And one of the things that I noticed is that at the end, people who are feeling suicidal have despair. And if you break the word despair into DES-TAIR, they feel unpaired with the future, hopeless, unpaired with the ability to get out of it, helpless, powerless, useless, worthless, meaningless, purposeless. And when they all line up, pointless to go on, and they form what I call a psychological adhesion to death as the way to take away their pain. And it's not an attachment, because you can sometimes talk to an attachment. You can sometimes reason with it, give it a little insight. But an adhesion is like a connection between your internal organs after surgery. You have to go in there and sever it. And there's a name that I gave to the process I developed called surgical empathy. And what happens is when people feel felt by you, which is different than feeling understood. Feeling understood's better than feeling misunderstood. But when people feel felt by you, and your main focus is to get to where the hurt is and how much it hurts, and you get them to start to express and talk about that hurt and how much it hurts and what it makes them want to do, if you don't rush them into a solution, but they feel felt by you, they may let go of death as the way to take away their pain and grab onto feeling felt. Something else I wanted to bring up that you also were all talking about. I was fortunate to be mentored by a bunch of people, and my last mentor was Larry King. I used to go to breakfast with him every day, and he was quite a character. And I remember there was a quote that he came up with, because Larry was one of the most curious people in television. In fact, people loved to be interviewed by him because he never hit you with a gotcha. He never tried to humiliate you. And so knowing that he wasn't going to do that, you opened up to him. And And I remember there was an expression, he said, you know, you can't be curious and furious at the same moment. Because when you're curious, it's a sensory experience. You're curious about what's going on. Whereas when you're furious, it's an impulse. You're about to attack people. And I'll just share, I think, a personal anecdote. I remember some years ago, my wife and I were bickering, and she was saying something and I was saying something. And one of the best ways to stop an argument right at the beginning is to ask yourself, what's it like for the other person right now? So rather than reloading and snapping back at her, which we could certainly go into, I paused after she said something, and I thought to myself, does she like where this is going? And I realized she didn't. So I paused and I said, do you like where this is going? Because it was heading for me sleeping in the, in the den.
Right.
She said, no, I can't stand it. I said, I don't like it either. Do you have any idea how we can prevent it from going there? At that point, she smiled and she said, no, but you're doing good.
100%. This is so interesting because, first of all, that sounds like my household. My wife and I, that's one of the things that conflict is inevitable to people living in the same house around each other for, months and months at a time, particularly in COVID. But the debrief after conflict is always such a valuable part of the experience, and it deepens our love for one another, deepens our respect for one another. So from a personal point of view, I completely understand what you're saying. And Jeremy, this leads me to really kind of think about your work as a social psychologist and looking at a macro view of some of these kind of microscopic or micro experiences, intrapersonal or interpersonal. How do you, dealing with organizations, businesses, and conflict, or however those kind of issues that arise amongst organizations to the point where they would have to call someone like yourself in, thinking about what Dr. Goulston just offered in terms of that pause, that empathy, when you have in a workplace setting deadlines and other exterior factors that are not necessarily the same thing in a household or in a relationship that's personal. How would you even interpret or provide similar guidance when we're thinking about resolving conflict or rolling with that resistance, if you will, using it to the advantage of putting yourself in the other shoes and so forth?
Well, listen, I in my experience, this sort of thing where we're talking about pausing, trying to perspective take, having empathy, it's not natural for most people. It's certainly not natural for most people when they're defensive. So if people are finding themselves getting into conflicts, or they're finding their workplace or organization with a lot of conflict between people, that seems to not go away, and they can't figure out how to resolve it internally, they may be motivated enough to learn some skills around this. And sometimes it's very simple. It's simple to learn, but not necessarily simple to implement. But if they're motivated enough to put the effort in to actually, so learn some of these skills. Okay, what are some techniques for pausing? What are some techniques for self-regulation when I'm feeling escalated? How do I breathe correctly? What do I focus on? That kind of thing. And then, okay, then what do I say? How do I approach someone if I'm having a problem? How do I give feedback to them? How do I receive feedback from them? How do I do all these things? If they're willing to get some training and they're motivated enough to take some of that training and actually try it out and implement it, typically it creates a much healthier kind of workspace or interpersonal relationships in the organization. But again, I think we're talking about this balance between how do I balance me being efficient, having to get things done, with taking time to learn this and practice it and put effort in. And at the end of the day, I think it's you got to find the motivation. I would ask, how much time and energy and maybe revenue are conflicts costing you? Would it be worth putting some time in here as an investment in saving some of that time? Would that cost benefit analysis work out? So that's something that we could, we talk about sometimes with leaders or with anyone that's in conflict in an organization, and they're trying to figure out that same question, like, why should I put the time into, resolving this with this person? I don't even want to work with them, but if you want to work here, you kind of got to work with them. So would it be better to have a better relationship in the long run? Would it cause less stress for you? Would you have a more pleasant experience at work? Would it be more efficient in the long run? Or do you want to continue as is and, see how that goes? So got to help people build the motivation, I think, to navigate that balance between efficiency and effort.
And I think, in both of the roles that you professionals have played, you guys from a more mental health or psychological point of view at the minimum, and then Alicia, you doing what you're doing voluntarily or through the books that you've written, focusing on really healing, right? The grievances or the disconnects that put people at odds with one another. Each one of you bring a certain vantage point to the table. I'm going to raise one last question. It's going to be a question for each one of you, and then we'll move into our Q&A portion of the conversation. And that question is simply, what does healing through conflict look like? We've heard a lot of anecdotal situations. We've heard a lot of personal story, but in general, as a clear line takeaway for people to understand the virtue of what this conversation has been, what does healing through conflict mean to you? And I'll get to each one of you guys, but I'm going to start with ladies first.
Thank you so much, Joe. It looks like healing through conflict looks like transformation. And it looks like global transformation. To kind of piggyback on what Jeremy was speaking about, the workforce is going to be changing. It's changing in front of our eyes right now. We were actually talking about ChatGPT before we even jumped on with artificial intelligence and technology, and humans get to human. We haven't been humaning very well, and I think we're actually going to be forced to human better because we're going to have, that's going to be our jobs. That's going to be our skill sets. It's to be able to connect with our neighbors and our family and our friends and our coworkers and our colleagues. We get to human better. And we talked about some of the things that are required to human better: empathy, compassion, listening, and being able to solve problems together. And so I feel like talking to your enemies. One of the stories I use in the book is Daryl Davis, who's pretty well known. He has a TED Talk and a book and a documentary, but he was known as being a blues musician, and he was playing a set, and the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan walked into his set and shared with him after he played. He goes, "Well, you play guitar mighty good for a Black man." And Daryl Davis, he said he didn't get offended. He instead said, "Can I pull up a chair and share with you the history of rock and roll?" And so what happened in this situation is something that could be seen as very hurtful, racist, and all of those things. He was able to shift it into an opportunity to delve deeper with that person. And what ended up happening is they ended up becoming best friends, and through Daryl's commitment and compassion and listening and empathy and attending several KKK rallies and just being in that community, about 200 people ended up leaving because they could not reconcile their hate with this man's love. And so I see that as exhilarating. Yes, it's emotionally laborious. And I feel human beings, we're here to human. We are here to connect with other human beings. And as Martin Luther King says, our destinies are bound. And so someone who has hate in their hearts or misinformation or doesn't have the skills, we can let them be. But then if we let them be, they're going to go create harm and destruction. So how do we get to stand for them as another human being? And through that process, we grow as well. So I think that's what's available for us.
That's
Through
so well
healing through
said.
conflict.
So eloquently said. Thank you. I mean, it was palpable. We get to be humans. I mean, that's the highest gift that we have, and especially me as you know, a member of clergy. I just think being made and formed in the image and likeness of God, and God is love. To be able to experience and express that is just a valuable gift, and I think you articulated it so well. Jeremy, I'm going to turn to you. When we think about the question again being, what does healing through conflict mean to you? What would be your final thoughts?
Well, I think I'll give you like a very practical framework that I can think about, and very quick. Conflicts happen a lot in workplaces and even in relationships when people are giving and receiving feedback to each other. In other words, when they're telling someone, hey, what you did didn't sit well with me, or hey, what you're doing isn't fitting with this relationship, or something like that. So, and then someone else receives that, and they might respond defensively or something like that. So they can become that can be the start of an escalated conflict. So what I've seen through that process, when someone brings some feedback to you or to someone, and this has happened personally to me. I've seen it happen personally with my clients, where someone brings someone feedback. They say, hey, this really didn't sit well with me the other day when you did that, or when, I interpreted it this way, and, it's not sitting well, and I'm starting to feel really demoralized. And if the person responding to that does not get defensive, but instead really listens, really hears them, and owns whatever they need to own, whether it was their behavior or their miscommunication, or owns some part of it, and then gets to a place where they can say, how do I do better for you going forward? What can I do better in the future? If that's the response to someone bringing, boy, I've seen more trust be built through that sort of conflict than I've seen be built through like positive reinforcement. Just like, hey, you're doing great and all that stuff. That's all good. But when a conflict happens and someone responds in an effective way, that builds even more trust in my experience. So I think conflict is absolutely, to me, the best opportunity for healing, as opposed to even just like positive, messages or reinforcement.
Wow. Thank you. It makes perfect sense. And, I'll go back to two things before we wrap up this question with Mark. First of all, curiosity. I'm hearing that consistently. You have to be curious about other people. You have to be interested in engaging other people. And I think that curiosity is, as Mark, you described, Larry King, and really not trying to gotcha, but really engaging folks for who they are as people is important. And then I'm paraphrasing, but I'm hearing this, the high road, and who has the wherewithal and the strength of ego to allow circumstances to create deeper dialogue, this feedback you're talking about, Jeremy. And so perhaps when we get to our Q&A, someone will ask the question and we'll get to it. But for now, Mark, the question comes to you. What does healing through conflict mean to you?
A wonderful book that came out in the last few years was written by Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Bruce Perry. And the title was What Happened to You? And it's really the basis for trauma-informed therapy. And the key is realizing that no matter how someone is reacting, something happened to them that triggered it. And if you can know that if someone is reacting in a certain way, and if you can just center yourself and say, what happened to you that this is what you're saying? This is how you're saying it. And if you can believe that something happened to them that has triggered them. And if you can know that it's always true, then you open them up. Also, what healing through conflict means to me is most people avoid conflict or get angry with conflict. And both of those things really mess with your nervous system and your physiological system. So both those things actually increase cortisol, and cortisol, as we talked about, can cause you to have this amygdala hijack and not be able to think clearly, and instead you're reacting. So I think when you can talk and walk your way through conflict, you have the chance to avert that. One of the tactics that I use with people sometimes, and you can try this in your own relationships, when someone expresses themselves or they vent at you, let them finish. And then if you say to them, "You sound frustrated and I think you're holding back," they're going to go, "What?" And if you say, "You sound frustrated and I think you're holding back because I think you're upset and disappointed too," and then you get them to talk through each of those, and you get them to clarify and go deeper, by the time they get to disappointment, it's a much calmer conversation. And sometimes they're actually grateful to you for understanding, but also being able to walk them through, down from frustration through upset to disappointment. And use the word upset, because if you say you seem frustrated, and I'll bet you're angry and disappointed too. Anger, the word is a trigger. I am not angry, so use the word upset. And I think that can heal a lot of conversations.
I mean, wow. Just so simple, eloquent, and heartfelt. That's the thing I'm drawing from each one of your answers. Clearly, your resumes are prolific. You guys have a lot under your belt that you've already contributed to the world. But just in this brief moment in time this evening, how you've summarized years and years and years of work into very poignant statements, I think that's commendable. Thank you for everything that you have done to make this world a better place, even when you're the lone wolf crying in the wilderness, that we can do better and that we can be more human to one another. Alicia, I think that was so profound. We get to do human even more humanely, and I'm paraphrasing, but I think it makes sense. This is the audience time to turn your responses or questions to the panelists. We have one question in the Q&A already. Wow, this is a long one. Let me read through it, you guys, see if we can break it down or what comes out of it. But this is from an anonymous attendee, and they asked the question: these days, there's a good increasing awareness on self-care. And many folks talk about the emotional strain of facing conflict, and are talking to people that one finds difficult can have an emotional toll. There's value in building mindful, and there is value in being mindful of your emotional capacity at any given time. But sometimes I wonder if that message has often gone too far, to the point of writing people off, and that sometimes self-care can become a way of avoiding conflict. Any insights on how we can find the lines between self-care and avoidance of something that, if faced, may provide some transformational benefit? So lot going on there, but the point is well taken, that do we mask under the cloak of some colloquial thought, self-care really becomes avoidance? Any feedback or response to the question?
I've heard this conversation, and there was an article, I forgot what magazine, I think it was Minal magazine, that there's a spike in loneliness, and there's a spike in people choosing to be alone because they want peace. So there's a striving to have your inner peace and your self-care, so that beyond boundaries, you just are writing people off. You're canceling people. You will no longer talk to that person. You're cutting people off. And so what is interesting is then we're not learning the skills on how to navigate life. We're not learning the skills on how to be human. Then we're just a whole bunch of silos out there. And we've definitely seen that spike since COVID. And so how can you be a both and? How can you be a stand for your relationship, a stand for someone else and perhaps their personal growth, and in turn your personal growth, while maintaining peace and self-care? And my answer to that would be through really powerful boundaries. And one thing that I have in my book is I have a 3-step approach to what I call a mindful response. And so number 1 is a kind acknowledgement. We get to be kind. We can even dig deep and find something good to say about someone, even if they just harmed us. It's going to require something of us, but we get to dig deep. So we get to have a kind acknowledgement, then a mindful response, and then a powerful request. And so personally, I can use my example of my mom. And for years, my mom would just talk about, when are you going to buy a house? When are you going to buy a house? When are you going to buy a house? That was like a conversation that I had with her for years. And I just said, Mom, I know that you're sharing this with me because you love me. And it's out of an abundance of care and caution that you're sharing, your concerns with me. And I find that this conversation is causing me pain and stress, because I am trying to find a house and, I'm confronting some issues. My request is that we no longer talk about this. So I'm requesting that we no longer talk about me buying a house. And guess what? She never brought it up again. And so I was able to acknowledge her through kindness, share a mindful response, what was coming up for me, and then a powerful request. So that created a boundary, and that created the inner peace for me, while being able to talk to my mom about other things and not cutting off that relationship. So that's what I would share.
I think, that wonderful summary to the question. And again, I'll pose the last part of the question for you guys again, just for some input. Any insights on how we can find the line between self-care and avoidance of something that if faced may provide some transformational benefit? And your response, Alicia, was fantastic, using that very personal example of you and your mom, because hey, that may be one of the hardest conversations to be honest in, just because you don't want to send that pressure back the other direction. So I think that was an excellent response. Any feedback from you two gentlemen to that question?
Well, I've had some mixed feelings. I think self-care is great. I think mindfulness and meditation is great at centering yourself. One of my issues with it is it's not interpersonal. Now, it's good to calm yourself down so that you're not reactive with other people. Something that I think does both self-care and has the interpersonal component is this quote that I heard from a friend of mine, Dr. Shawnee Duperon, and she created a organization called Project Forgive with Desmond Tutu. It was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. It didn't get it. And the quote is, and I think this is worth writing down, forgiveness is accepting the apology you will never receive. Think about that. Forgiveness is accepting the apology you will never receive. And when I heard that, my head almost fell off. And I heard my dad, who died in 1995, apologize to me for being critical, being dismissive of me, and actually saying, that it was his problem. And his apology said, given what you've done in the world and the lives you've saved, I don't deserve you as my son. And I'm sorry. And what I realized is there's two parts to this kind of apology, because after I realized that is what he would say underneath it all, I realized I owed him an apology. And I said, I want to apologize to you for having a chip on my shoulder, for holding a grudge against you. And I should have understood that you were under a lot of pressure. You were worried about being able to provide for the family. And hey, I'm the shrink in the family. I should have known this. And I said, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry I held that grudge. And I can finally say the 6 words that I hadn't been able to say, which is, I miss you and I love you.
Wow, that is profound. I mean, clearly the best lessons are the ones that have been lived, right? It gives you absolute context. You're an insider to the experience. Thank you for that. Jeremy, thoughts on the question? Should I repeat it? You kind of got it.
Yeah, I mean, I like what, first of all, there's a sentiment here that says it shouldn't be an either or question. That part of self-care should be included in interpersonal conflict resolution. That is part of self-care. How do you have better relationships? How do you build trust? How do you manage and prevent conflict? That's all part of self-care. When I hear this question, I kind of think about like, what is the line between should I put in the effort to like confront someone when something's bothering me, or should I just kind of deal with it on my own, maybe just let it be, it's not worth it. So just like figure out how to deal with it, right? And that's a good question, because sometimes it might be better, at least in the short term, to just kind of figure out how to deal with it. Most of the time, it's probably better to actually have a conversation, but you got to kind of figure out, what's the likelihood of this person actually making a change? Have I had this conversation with them before and nothing's happened? Am I just going to get frustrated? So we've got to have that sort of navigation at the end of the day. And so it's a good question. I think every situation is unique, and you kind of have to figure out like, what is the right strategy? Do I just figure out how to self-care and just deal with what's going on? Or do I have a conversation and see if I can make it better? I always default to the kind of see if you can make it better. But again, there's situations in which it might make it worse, or it might not go anywhere and just make you more frustrated. So you kind of have to balance those and navigate.
It's that human thing, as Alicia had talked about, for sure. There's one more question. We have a couple of minutes left, and this one is directed directly to you, Jeremy. And the question says, it's regarding workplace skills. Are there some strategies that you would recommend for all organizations to put in place as a good place to start for creating more communicative teams?
Well, first off, that's a question that might take a long time to answer. So I'll try to be quick about it. There's a number of strategies that I think are really important. I think number one, I think leaders need to be trained. A lot of times what happens in workplaces is leaders get promoted, or they even get brought in from the outside, and they actually don't have formal leadership training. They just have a resume, or they've done a lot of this work before and have been a lot of experience, but they don't have actual leadership training. And leadership training is different than just having the experience of that particular role or that particular department. So it's really important to get that training. There's all kinds of soft skills that need to be happening when you're a leader. So that's number one. Culture is built from the top down. It is supported by the bottom up, but it's built from the top down. If leaders are not building a healthy culture, it is not going to be a healthy culture. So leadership needs to get trained. And the other one is, I'll just like very simply, you ought to be having regular team meetings. Don't over meet, don't have meeting fatigue, but you have to, at least once a week, you should be meeting with your like small team or department, and at least once a month, maybe the larger team, and at least once a quarter, maybe the whole company, depending on how big it is. So there needs to be regular touch points, and those touch points, they don't have to be all strategy or tactics or action items. It doesn't have to be that. It's just, hey, how's everybody doing? Does anybody need anything from anyone? I do a weekly team meeting, and I come up with like a prompt. A prompt could be like, each person tell me one thing that you've learned in the last year that you really think is important. Or each person, tell me one person that you really admire who changed your life in some positive way. We go around and we just have little touch points like that. And I think that's really important. I see a lot of companies not doing regular, just even 30-minute weekly meeting with everybody together. They don't do it. And people feel like they're in silos, they're not communicating, et cetera. So I think that's really important.
You know, I mean, this actually could have went for 2 hours, easy.
Yeah.
Crammed a lot into this. I want to thank Jessica Ellis and the board and all of the volunteers that make up the great organization of CYS. They have the opportunity, the privilege, the blessing, if you will, to show up every day in communities that are underserved, marginalized, and definitely impacted by all of the social conditions that poverty and lack create. And I just want to thank you guys for the opportunity to have sat in this seat to navigate this conversation, to be a part of, at least in this small way, contributing to the life-changing work that's going on at Centinela Youth Services and all of their component parts. You can donate. Information's been provided in the chat for that. Opportunities to volunteer have been provided in the chat. I think Jeremy's point so eloquently stated that, you know, coming together and just having time to, and I'll use your word, Mark, you use this term, psychological safety, to create safe spaces psychologically that people can feel the confidence that they're respected and humanized. I think that's being applied on a regular basis through the work of Centinela Youth Services, particularly through the lens of their restorative justice program. And so just really grateful to be here. That's it, folks. We have done our thing tonight. What a wonderful privilege to have been able to be in the space with you beautiful and intelligent people who have a tremendous amount of compassion. And I'll use your word again, Dr. Goulston, empathy for humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. You did a great job facilitating this. Really masterful. Thank you.
Fantastic job, Joe. Thank you. And I would just love to wrap this up by everyone just sharing one word that they're feeling right now after this 60-minute conversation. That was so powerful.
First word for me is
We got
blessed.
lots of, Dorothy says hope, blessed, encouraged, connected, hopeful. Love that. And what do the speakers want to share? Empowered, grateful. I'm just reading the chat right now. It's all coming in.
Jeremy, one word.
Aligned.
Lined?
Aligned.
Aligned.
Aligned. I like it. I like it. Yes, sir. Mark, one word.
Belonging.
Alone. Wow. And Alicia, one word.
Healed.
Healed. Hey. My one word, I'll say it again. I think I'll reiterate something that was said in the chat. Blessed. Just spoken well of. Absolutely. So thank you guys. Thank you for your time this evening. Thank you for caring enough to tune in and give us a small bit of your day. Hopefully something was said that really was worth your time this evening. Obviously, you can visit CYS website for more information. And then thank you for being a co-pilot on this work this evening. Really appreciate you.
Very good, everyone. Be well.